Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's Democratic Roundtable on ICE's response to COVID-19 in detention facilities. I am Gerald Nadler, Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and we are joined today by Zoe Lofgren, the Chair of the Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship, as well as by several members of our committee and some guests who will share their perspectives on today's important topic. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy during these challenging times. I appreciate that so many members could gather today for this discussion. And I'm particularly pleased that the public will have an opportunity to listen to our conversation. Democrats have done a lot of important work over the past few weeks responding to the COVID crisis. This is the first public roundtable this committee is holding. We expect to schedule other public events in the near future. I also want to thank our guests for taking the time to participate in this roundtable, and I thank everyone in advance for bearing with any technological glitches we may have. At this time, I will turn it over to the chair of the subcommittee, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. At the outset, I want to provide a few guidelines that I think will help this roundtable go smoothly. First, I would ask everybody to mute their microphones unless they are talking. This will minimize interruptions or stray noises in the background. I'm going to have my video feed on during the entire roundtable, but if you prefer to participate in this roundtable just through audio, or if you'd like to be visible only when it's your turn to speak, you're welcome to turn off your camera at any time. I want to briefly explain how today's roundtable will work. I'll make a few opening comments, and then Chairman Nadler will make some opening comments. Our guests will then follow with brief opening remarks, and then the members will have an opportunity to ask questions. This will allow for an informal give and take between members and our guests, in contrast with the more rigid rules that apply during a formal hearing. I appreciate the value of everybody's time, and I hope that we can manage our time efficiently. I'm going to limit myself to just one or two questions, and I hope other members will too. My hope is that we can have a good conversation and wrap up by 2 p.m. I thank everyone for their patience, and I look forward to a good discussion. Now, I'd just like to make a few opening comments. 8 weeks ago on March 13th, the House declared a national emergency. We have, unfortunately, the Trump administration failed to effectively lead the country through this COVID-19 emergency. The administration's conflicting statements and falsehoods uttered at daily press briefings, their inability to secure sufficient protective equipment and testing across the nation, the reckless suggestions related to dangerous drugs and chemicals, and even public statements intended to cause civil disobedience present an incompetent approach to this most serious emergency. These failures have been public and covered in the press, but there are failures that have disastrous effects that are out of the public view. And this is true in the administration's mishandling of the immigration detention system in the face of this deadly pandemic. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, the agency responsible for managing the civil detention facilities across our country, failed to take action to reduce the spread of COVID-19 in immigration detention. As of Tuesday evening, ICE reports that at least 881 detainees have tested positive across at least 41 different ICE facilities in 19 states. So far, one detainee and two contract detention guards have died. It is almost certain that those numbers will go up. It is also almost certain that ICE's official figures significantly underrepresent the extent of the outbreak in ICE detention. As ICE has confirmed, fewer than 1,800 out of almost 30,000 detainees had been tested by the start of this week. In March and in April, Chairman Nadler and I wrote letters to ICE demanding that the agency decrease the detention population by releasing detainees who pose no threat to public safety or national security, particularly those who are vulnerable to infection by COVID-19. Many others wrote similar letters to ICE. but ICE largely ignored those requests. Since the outbreak began, ICE has released only a small number of individuals, keeping its detention population at an unmanageable and deadly level given the pandemic. Instead of reducing population levels, ICE issued guidance on social distancing and hygiene standards in detention facilities. According to nonprofit organizations on the ground, this guidance has been largely ignored. Even worse, ICE has continued to transfer detainees around the country, including from facilities known to have COVID exposure, thus promoting spread of the virus throughout ICE's detention network and likely into the communities where these detention centers are located. ICE's activities have endangered lives, not only here but abroad. As ICE continued to conduct removals, it failed to test detainees or take other the public health minister of Guatemala announced that at least 99 individuals who've been returned to Guatemala by the United States had tested positive for COVID-19. Even as the Trump administration has used this public health emergency as an excuse to shut our borders to families and children seeking asylum, it has simultaneously exported the virus to other countries, undermining the global public health response. This roundtable will allow members of the press and public to learn more about ICE's response to the current public health crisis. We've invited an immigration policy expert and two individuals who have firsthand knowledge of the conditions in detention. One was recently detained in an ICE facility. The other is the spouse of someone who's still detained by ICE today, and we commend their willingness to speak out. I would now like to invite Chairman Nadler to briefly offer any thoughts that he might have. And Mr. Chairman, you need to unmute your mic.
Thank you, Zoe. For most of our nation's history, immigration matters were treated as issues of civil, not criminal justice. In that spirit, the detention of immigrants in facilities that are nearly indistinguishable from jails and prisons should be the exception, not the rule. Unfortunately, in our recent history, and especially under this administration, tens of thousands of civil immigrant detainees are held in terrible conditions and for long periods. COVID-19 pandemic has made clear the deadly consequences of mass immigration detention. In September, the Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship held a hearing in which witnesses and members discussed how, under this administration, the number of people detained by ICE has skyrocketed, while detention conditions have deteriorated. In that hearing, we warned the agency about the imminent and dire consequences of holding immigrant detainees in inhumane conditions. Today, the outbreak of COVID-19 and its extensive spread through the ICE detention system have shown the tragic cost of ICE's mismanagement and failure to improve conditions. On April 7th, when Subcommittee Chair Lofgren and I wrote our letter urging ICE to release individuals who pose no threat to public safety or national security, particularly those who are at heightened risk of death or serious illness from COVID-19, there were 13 individuals at that time, April 7th, who had tested positive for the virus at 8 different facilities. Today, after ICE largely ignored our request, 1 month later, there are at least 881 individuals who have tested positive in dozens of ICE facilities across the country. And because ICE lacks the capacity to test all detainees, it is likely that the number of confirmed cases is actually much higher. We have the capability to safely and compassionately process migrants, including women and children, and to ensure that individuals appear for scheduled hearings. Instead of indiscriminately detaining immigrants, ICE could employ a broad array of alternatives to detention, many of which are extraordinarily successful at ensuring attendance in immigration court hearings, which is the only proper purpose, while also being far less expensive. Trump administration's immigration actions in response to the COVID-19 pandemic have been ineffective as a matter of policy and offensive as a matter of basic human decency. I want to thank Representative Lofgren for leading this event, and I look forward to hearing from the other participants today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to now introduce today's guests. Heidi Altman is the Director of Policy at the National Immigrant Justice Center, an organization that provides legal services to more than 10,000 vulnerable immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers each year. Previously, she served as the legal director for the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition. She created the in-house Immigration Services Program at the Neighborhood Defender Services of Harlem and has served as a teaching fellow for Georgetown Law School's Immigration Clinic. Ms. Altman received her BA from Yale University and her JD from NYU School of Law. Astian Johannes Favi has resided in the U.S. since 2013. He is married to a U.S. citizen. His wife and he have three young U.S. citizen children. Mr. Favi had been in ICE custody since June of 2019 before being recently released by a federal judge based on his heightened vulnerability to COVID-19 due to pre-existing medical conditions. We thank Mr. Favi for sharing his story with us today. And finally, we have Claudia Robles, who is a healthcare worker in Leadville, Colorado. Her husband has been in the United States for 16 years, and they have a U.S. citizen child together. He is currently detained in the Aurora Detention Center, which is run by the GEO Group, the second largest for-profit private prison company. He has just submitted a humanitarian parole application on his own. He has asthma and is afraid for his life while in ICE custody. We thank Claudia for all her life-saving work as a healthcare hero and for sharing her and her husband's story with us. We welcome our guests and we thank them for participating in today's roundtable. So now I would ask each of you to briefly share your perspectives with us. Ms. Altman, you may begin.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Nadler, Chairwoman Lothgren, and all the committee members for having us here today and for devoting this first public forum to this critical issue. Please know how much it means to so many. This is an issue that has impacted few more deeply than Maribel Escobar. Maribel remembers her brother Carlos as a kind man who helped people, a one-of-a-kind person. Carlos lived most of his life in the United States as a Californian, but in January, while his immigration case was proceeding, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, locked him up in a private prison complex in San Diego. On April 15th, an immigration judge denied Carlos's application for release on bond, finding him a flight risk, even though he wanted nothing more than to go home and be with his sister. Less than 2 weeks later, on April 24th, he was hospitalized with COVID-19 after having begged for medical assistance for weeks from the guards. And on May 6th, 1 week ago today, he died. Carlos's death is a tragedy, but the word tragedy does not go far enough. I ask us to consider today what it means when a death occurs in our government's custody because of abusive conditions and corruption that human rights monitors have reported on for decades. When the Department of Homeland Security's own watchdog agency reports that its detention system is governed by sham inspections and opaque contracts, and Congress responds by fueling that system's growth. It means that our government, our leaders, have to answer for Carlos's death and for the harm suffered by millions who have survived the United States immigration detention system and the many, like Maribel, whose loved ones did not survive it. Today, as you've heard, there are 881 people in immigration detention who've tested positive for COVID-19, spread across 41 different facilities. Public health and correctional health experts have called urgently on ICE to start releasing people in large numbers, predicting a, quote, tinderbox scenario without such action. ICE's response has been slow and cruel, thus far having released a mere approximately 3% of the detained population. Just weeks ago, a consortium of research institutes released a report with projections of the virus's spread in immigration detention. They estimated that under the most optimistic scenario, 72% of all people in ICE custody will be infected within 90 days, overwhelming surrounding hospital beds and ICUs in short order. In other words, unless change is swift and dramatic, many more people will die in ICE detention centers and in surrounding communities. The spread of COVID-19 in ICE's jails is like a lit match in a house already doused with gasoline. COVID-19 entered into a detention system made up of more than 200 county jails and prisons. More than 80% of people detained in ICE custodies are in facilities that are owned or managed by private prison companies. Cutting corners to maximize profits is baked in. Moldy and inedible food are common, medical care is inadequate and delayed, and most are forced to defend against deportation without a lawyer, with access to needed evidence thwarted at every turn. Particularly under this administration, release on bond or parole is exceedingly rare. More and more, the cost of fighting one's own deportation case is months, if not years, of imprisonment with no defined end date. ICE's reckless response to COVID-19 comes as no surprise. Federal courts have repeatedly found ICE in blatant disregard of the most basic protections that would allow people in custody a fighting chance to avoid the virus's spread. People inside these jails are bravely organizing and resisting, and they are met with pepper spray. Those of us outside advocating are struck by an incomprehensible reality of having to fight like hell and still failing to get ICE to give people behind bars enough soap during a global pandemic. It has not always been this way, and it doesn't need to be now. For the majority of the second half of the 20th century, it was the formal policy of the United States not to detain immigrants during their case proceedings. The incarceration of immigrants during their civil immigration cases is an experiment dating back to the 1980s, its growth fueled by profits and the same politics of racial animus that has resulted in the mass incarceration of communities of color across the country. ICE has the legal discretion to release everyone in its custody today. Instead, this administration is choosing to put countless communities at risk. Change cannot wait. And so first, members of Congress, we urge you to impose legislative restrictions on ICE's detention and enforcement apparatus in the next stimulus package. We're so glad to see some of those restrictions included in the HEROES Act and want to take the opportunity to applaud and thank Congresswoman Jayapal for her leadership of the first act, which represents many of the needed changes. And second, spending bills for the next fiscal year are being written. Members must insist that it's no longer business as usual for ICE. Now is the time to divest from the incarceration of immigrants and instead invest in communities and case management focused programming that has been shown to be a cheaper, effective, compassionate way to support immigrants during their case proceedings. Thank you to the members who are taking action. More is needed. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Altman. We appreciate your sharing your expertise with us, and we would now turn to Mr. Favi for comments that he might have.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johannes Favi, and I'm speaking to you today from Indianapolis, where I live with my wife and our children. I'm grateful to have the chance to be with them because only weeks ago, I was in immigration detention in the county jail in Kankakee, Illinois. I was detained there for almost 1 year waiting for the government to process a petition filed for my green card. While I was detained, my wife gave birth to our second child and our family lost our home. I met our new baby in a picture by mail. I saw a man detained with me hang himself to try to commit suicide. I feel traumatized still today from all that I saw. I'm 32-year-old and I have lived in the United States since 2013. My wife and I have 2 children, a 1.5-year-old little girl and a 5-month-old son. We are also raising my 5-year-old daughter who has a serious health issue that requires regular hospital visits. I have a history of health problems too, including a severe case of pneumonia that left me with ongoing respiratory problems. In June 2019, immigration officer arrested me at the courthouse in Indiana when I appeared in connection with an old case from 2015. That case is the only time I have ever been arrested, and I paid a heavy price when I accepted the plea bargain and spent months in jail. However, because of that old conviction, I was in immigration detention for nearly a year with no bond hearing. It felt to me like I was assumed guilty without having a chance to prove my innocence. Most of the people detained with me had no chance. And I would see that every Friday when they would deport 15 or more people at a time out of our cell block. Many people are deported so fast that between transfer, they are unable to communicate with their family abroad or even see a judge before they leave. The rest of us who tried to fight our case felt that we were desperately waiting for our turn to be slaughtered. Some waited for a year or 2 or 3 years surviving on antidepressant pills. I believe more than 60% of my block was on pills during the holiday season. A week before my son was born, I broke down. I was so stressed, anxious, that I was unable to sleep for 3 days. Being in that jail for so long, it felt like torture. ICE has the power to free you, but they don't want to. Keeping you in jail gets to your mind, to your soul. So you want to give up on your freedom and even on your life. We first start hearing about COVID-19 virus from the news. The officer will say to me, "You again with that story like it was some fake news." But to me, it was no joke because my life was in danger and my children were outside depending on me. When the outbreak started, the facility did not give us any instruction. No one told us to wash our hands or avoid touching our faces. They did not distribute gloves, masks, or hand sanitizer. The guard did not maintain social distance that would come too close to us to speak to us. It is impossible to practice social distancing in detention. I was housed in an open dorm in a block that had 48 people. It was split into 12 cubicles with divider, and each cubicle had 4 people sharing one toilet and one sink. We had to line up closely together to receive meal and eat together closely at table just like at a food court. When the coronavirus came, it was a disaster for my family. My wife had to try to care for the children herself while working all her shift at the post office. I worried so much for my daughter who had special needs. Who would be able to take her to the hospital? Who would be there for them? When the appointment with USCIS for my visa was canceled because of the virus, I fear my detention will have no end. If it wasn't for my legal team at the National Immigrant Justice Center and the decision of the federal court judge, I wouldn't have the chance to be with my family today. I still live in fear that one day ICE will arrest me again and handcuff me in front of my kid. I look at our life now and I know we have to start all over again. This could have been done differently. Did ICE really think I will run away when I'm a father of 3 children and they have my passport? Detention is not the solution for a civil matter like immigration, especially during this pandemic. It is wrong to put people in handcuffs and in handcuffs as if they were in a maximum security prison. I never thought the United States justice system could be this wrong. I think every day about the people who are still in detention who should not be there. Today, I'm given an opportunity to be their voice. Member of Congress, they are counting on you. I am thankful for your time listening to me today. I have faith in you. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Favi. We'd like to turn to you, Ms. Robles, for your comments.
My name is Claudia Robles, and I'm here to talk to you about my husband's detention in GEO in Aurora, Colorado. I am a medical assistant for the local urgent care and family practice in my small town of Leadville, Colorado. I am doing my best to serve my community during this pandemic, but my job keeps getting harder as coworkers get sick and I have to work more hours. My job as a mom to a 4-year-old named Julia gets harder since I'm basically a single mother without my husband. He was her primary caregiver before he was taken from us. My daughter has been affected the most with his detention. She misses her father every day and hopes to have him home again. She is struggling without her dad and has to be in mental health services. But now, due to the pandemic, she hasn't been able to attend any counseling. It's hard to do televisits with a 4-year-old. I'm worried about my husband getting sick with COVID-19 in detention. As a healthcare worker, I know they are not doing everything they need to keep everyone safe in there. He has to share a cell with 5 other people for most of the day, so it's impossible to follow social distancing. In the last month, he was in his cell for 23 hours a day. There were some times he was left in his cell for days at a time. They also only get face masks once a week, if that. He is at higher risk of getting COVID-19 and having worsening outcomes because of his asthma, especially because he does not receive any medication to manage his asthma. We submitted an application for humanitarian parole because of his high risk, but we have not heard yet. But he is a perfect example of who should be released. My husband has been in this country for 16 years and only has misdemeanors for an argument that we had, which is not a deportable offense. He also is not a flight risk. I hope he is granted his freedom so he can be safe home with my daughter and I.
Thank you very, very much, Ms. Robles, for sharing your experience and that of your husband. Now is the time when we're going to open up the floor for questions. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'll ask all members to limit themselves just to 1 or at most 2 questions. Every member will get a chance to ask questions. And I'll start just framing this a little bit. As I said in my opening statement, response to COVID-19.
Excuse me, Miss Lofgren, not to interrupt, but we're having technical issues on the judiciary end. So we took a little recess on the stream. And
Okay.
so it's gonna be a few minutes, but I just wanted to tell you that. So we're not live right now, but
Okay.
we lost connection, so then we'll go back.
Let me ask you, because I was getting a notice of connection issues, and I was wondering, ICE's response to COVID-19 has been incompetent. It's really been a failure. And that endangers not only the detainees, but also the staff at the facilities. As essential personnel, ICE and contractor staff are required to continue coming to work as long as they aren't sick, even as nearly everyone else around them is shut down. And as a result, we know of 2 ICE contract personnel who actually had died, and over 40 ICE staff who've contracted COVID-19, and it may be more than that. Ms. Altman, I'm wondering if you can discuss the danger posed to the staff and to the surrounding communities due to ICE's policies related to the pandemic. And as you're aware, we all know that many, if not most, of these ICE detention centers are located in rural communities with limited healthcare infrastructure. What is the impact of the surge in these cases on the staff and also the surrounding communities. Are you able to advise us on that?
Yes, thank you for the question. It's right. And 1/3 of all people in ICE detention are jailed at a facility that has only one hospital with ICU beds within 25 miles. And so that's why the topic of this roundtable is a matter of public health for the entirety of the country. We have heard from Johannes, who was in custody, but every detention center has people inside. It has officers, guards, medical personnel, staff, and they are all coming and going in and out of the facility. They're going home to their loved ones. And so I thought I think it's helpful to look at an example. There's a town called Natchez, Mississippi. And as I talk about this example for a second, I just want to note that it is actually illustrative of what is happening in all communities where there are ICE detention centers. There's a facility called the Adams County Correctional Facility in Natchez, Mississippi. There's about 1,000 people in detention there on any given day. Natchez is a small town in a county that has 30,000 people and only 15 ICU beds. And the town has taken COVID-19 very seriously. They created a preparedness task force. Very early on, that task force started getting calls made in a confidential manner from Core Civic employees. Core Civic runs that facility. It's a private prison company. And these folks were scared to go to work. They were deemed essential. They had to be going in and out of this facility, even as they knew that ICE was not taking the steps required and recommended by the CDC. Tragically, shortly into the outbreak, there was a transfer. ICE transferred about 200 new people in that facility. Fast forward a few weeks, there's now 15 confirmed positive cases of COVID-19 at Adams County. And in the surrounding community of Adams County, there's 148 confirmed cases, which puts the population there at a more than 40% higher rate of COVID-19 positives than the national rate. So again, we're talking about ICE's actions impacting all of our communities and all of your constituents and their loved ones.
Report. I understand that we're having problems with our video feed, but the audio is fine. So let's proceed. And I now will ask Mr. Nadler if he has questions that he would like to ask.
Sure, thank you very much. I have two questions for Ms. Altman. As you know, the immigration court system has been mismanaged by the Executive Office for Immigration Review for years. The agency's response to this pandemic has been especially appalling, and you've outlined some of the consequences. Now, they have postponed all non-detained hearings during this pandemic, but detained hearings are still going on. Many immigration courts in detention centers are still operating. Do you think that the courts should be closed, or should they be moved out of the detention centers so they can be used to get people out of the detention centers? What should be our policy there? My first question.
Thank you. Thanks for raising that. Yeah. So we're supporting a set of very common sense policy asks that our colleagues at the American Immigration Lawyers Association have put forward, asking that all in-person hearings should be suspended. It would seem that would be common sense. You can imagine the risks to, again, the people in the courts and the people outside of all of the court personnel having to come in. We're also asking that hearings on the detained docket move forward, but only by remote methods. And that's so critical because, as we're talking about today, releasing folks from detention is the best way that these agencies can work together toward the public health, and the courts have a role to play. So we believe that they should be expediting bond or custody redetermination hearings and allowing them to go forward in a remote way. The other recommendation, of course, is that if people are forced to come in, as we understand in some cases they are still doing when immigration judges are refusing to allow remote representation by lawyers, they should be given protection. They should be given PPE. And although ICE has sort of informally told the press that they would be providing PPE to attorneys, we hear that is happening in some places and not in others.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I have one further question, and that is, we've heard from our other witnesses appalling statements of the conditions in the ICE detention facilities. 4 or 8 people to a cell, inability to have social distancing, inability to get enough soap, all the conditions calculated to generate an epidemic, to generate cases of COVID-19 among the detainees and staff, and to make these detention facilities hotbeds to spread the disease throughout the community. Now, Chairwoman Lofgren and I have written letter after letter to the department saying, stop this, release people from detention, etc. And I refer to my opening statement to the fact that historically this has all been civil, not criminal. There shouldn't be most people in detention, and we've been ignored essentially, as you know. I am intrigued by a mention you made of appropriations. Do you think that it would be effective if we were to say in the next appropriations bill, which probably which doesn't go into effect unfortunately until September, but that you can't spend any appropriations to keep people in detention or something to that effect? You must release them.
Yes, very simple. I think that, for too long now, ICE has disregarded the balance of powers. Appropriations committees have been saying for years that it's time to move away from reliance on incarceration, and ICE has gone in the opposite direction, blatantly disregarding the funding amounts that Congress has provided. And so, yes, I cannot say more emphatically to that idea, Congressman Nadler. We have the studies, we have the evidence. We know that the investment of funds will go so much further, both in terms of supporting people, supporting communities, and making the immigration court system work efficiently by instituting community-based alternative programs where people have case management and they're set up for success, rather than being held in a punitive system when these are civil proceedings. So we know how to do it. We know how to use the funds if they're given to the community and invested, instead of taking away and putting the money towards these jails that are causing so much harm.
Thank you very much.
Now to the Vice Chair of the Immigration Subcommittee, our colleague, Ms. Jayapal, speaking to us from Washington State.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Lofgren and Chairman Nadler. We so appreciate you doing this meeting today for us to lift up these issues. And thank you to all three witnesses for sharing very powerful testimony. We are seeing a crisis within a crisis unfold in immigration detention. And weeks ago, I introduced the first act with Senator Cory Booker to address the potentially life-threatening conditions faced by nearly 30,000 people every day in immigration detention, including the risk to vulnerable immigrants in detention, the need to reduce the population to prevent the spread of coronavirus, and the need for improved access to hygiene products for those who remain in detention. As of today, there are 881 confirmed cases in ICE custody with a 51% positive rate, signaling that this is a severe undercount due to lack of testing. And we know in the best of circumstances, ICE routinely fails to deliver quality medical care. So it's on us to hold ICE to a higher standard during this pandemic. I have two questions, one for Mr. Favi and one for Ms. Altman. And I would ask that each of you take about a minute and a half so that we can get to both questions in the time I'm trying to stick to. Mr. Favi, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for your very compelling story and courage. You were detained throughout March and into April of this year as COVID-19 began to take hold. Can you speak a little bit more to how safe you felt being in detention when you heard about the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you, ma'am. I felt terrible. I was mentally destroyed every day when I watch the news and I see thousands of people dying. And I think about my daughter who have a health issue. I think about my family, my wife. I was completely mentally sick. And I tried to let my lawyer know And thank to the judge that grant me the ABS petition that freed me today. Otherwise, I still be in detention right now.
Thank you, Mr. Flavi. And I know you were living in very close quarters without social distancing, and your history of pneumonia, which obviously puts you at very, very high risk. Thank you for that powerful testimony, and I'm glad that you're out of that terrifying situation. Your story echoes so much of what we've heard around the country from many others. Ms. Altman, your very compelling testimony. You are the director of policy and an attorney for the National Immigrant Justice Center, which does direct legal representation, research, and advocacy for immigrants in detention. And you're widely considered one of the foremost experts in immigration detention in the country. In your testimony, you focus on the need to release people from detention. Contrary to what ICE would have you believe, the agency does have a vast menu of options to release people. Can you please explain for us why reducing the population in detention by releasing people into communities is both the best option for safety of immigrants in detention and for communities across the country?
Thank you for the kind words, Congresswoman, and for your leadership on the First Act and so many of the issues we're discussing today. Yes. So I think that we have known for a long time, and we have a wide body of literature and evidence to support the fact that there are programs that focus on case management that are based in the community that provide an entirely alternative way to think about the processing of immigration cases in the United States. And so we have actually programs like this operating in the United States, but we also can look to other countries. And we have known for many, many years, these programs have, over 90% rates of compliance in terms of showing that when people are supported, when they have case management, when they have referrals for social services and housing and medical care, and then when their needs are met for faith and other sort of wellness needs, that they come to court. They want to pursue their cases, and they're more invested in the process because they see it as fair. These programs are also over 80% cheaper than the use of secure detention. And I think that what COVID-19 has done is it has just shown one more way in which we are just shooting ourselves in the foot nationally by continuing to pour money into this system that is hurting the people inside of it, and now so clearly hurting all of our communities. There are more sustainable, more viable, and compassionate ways to do this.
Thank you, Ms. Altman. It really is incredibly unfortunate that ICE is failing at its job of keeping people in its custody safe. I want to point out to everybody listening to this that just last week, we tragically lost Carlos Escobar Mejia, the first person to die in ICE custody of COVID-19, and the 11th person to die in ICE custody this fiscal year. And I just continue to be struck by the report that days before his death, an ICE attorney asked a judge to pray for Mr. Escobar Mejia rather than just advocating for his release. We're talking about a man who had all these various conditions that made him so much more vulnerable to COVID-19. And just a couple of months ago, ICE said it would release people in its custody, recognizing the huge risk of COVID-19. And we thought that was a good step, but unfortunately, we've only seen a 2% drop among people in custody. So if ICE can't be trusted to do the right thing, then Congress must shoulder that responsibility. And it's precisely why we must pass the First Act to provide for the immediate release of vulnerable people in ICE custody. And I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and look forward to working with all of them to restore humanity to this broken system. Thank you both so much. And Madam Chair, I yield back to you.
Thank you very much. I think we will take a very brief recess. Stay tuned, as I'll call you back in just a few minutes. call the hearing back into, not the hearing, the meeting back into order, and to turn now to our friend, Mr. Correa, who joins us from Orange County, California.
Thank
Will,
you,
your turn.
Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Want to thank you and Chairman Nadler for holding this most important hearing. I also want to echo the comments made by my colleagues in thanking our witnesses for being here today. Rather hear it from you than having to wait to read it, your thoughts in the newspapers. Um, I wanted to ask a question of Ms. Altman. Ms. Altman, in March, a few weeks ago, I wrote a letter to Attorney General Barr asking that he suspend all immigration court hearings and parole all nonviolent detainees given the COVID-19 pandemic. I've not heard anything since. You mentioned in your testimony that you have, in your words, studies and evidence of community-based programs. And my thought is, given our obligations to provide due process, given the possibilities of denying due process, given the challenges of health and safety, not only of our detainees, but of the staff members as well. Um, what is, what's the downside? What is the problem with releasing all nonviolent detainees? Do we not have a bond system in place to assure that they comply with their court-ordered returns? Ankle GPSs, all of these uh, tools are available to make sure that these individuals that are temporarily released can return for their court hearings. In my district, every month I see uh, people, individuals show up to their appointed check-in times, and they risk being deported. Yet, given that risk, these individuals still show up and present themselves to ICE individuals and comply with the law. So my question to you is, what's the downside in releasing nonviolent offenders?
Thank you, Congressman Correa, and for the letters and the persistence with which you've pursued them. We're so grateful. I'm going to not mince words. This is about politics. This is about this administration from day one having preferenced policies that are hostile and impose intentional cruelty on immigrant communities over compassion, over the law, and now over all of our public health. So I'll give you just a few stats to give you a sense. There are thousands of people sitting in detention eligible for release this very moment without any additional file reviews. ICE's own data shows there's 5,040 people in detention right now who have already passed their threshold interview, showing that they have eligibility for asylum or similar types of relief. Those folks, per ICE's own policies, are immediately eligible for release under something called humanitarian parole. Studies show that more than 90% of people in that category, asylum seekers, have loved ones and family members with homes that they could immediately go to shelter in place. There are many more folks who already have had bond hearings or bond determinations by DHS, and they're stuck in detention just because they can't afford the bond. If that bond was revoked, they could immediately be released. As you said, ICE runs its own alternative to detention programs with tens of thousands of participant slots that they could be using, but they could also be releasing people on recognizance. And again, we have so many studies that show that when people are in the community, when they have access to legal representation, their appearance rates are upwards of 90%. People do very well. They do so much better in the community when they're supported by their loved ones. So this is about political will.
So again, to repeat, you said compliance is up to 90% in these cases for these nonviolent offenders to show up in their, date of court appearances.
That's absolutely right. There's numerous studies now looking at this. Compliance rates, when you aggregate the studies, is always above 90%.
Above 90%.
above
Okay.
90%. And here in the United States, when studies look at people who are able to get access to counsel so that they have someone actually giving them guidance about what their obligations are, some studies show compliance rates of between 95 and 100%.
Thank you, Ms. Altman, and Madam Chair, I yield.
Thank you very much, Lou. Sylvia Garcia, our valued member from Texas, is recognized now.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chairman Nadler, also for putting together this very important hearing. I know many of us, particularly those of us in the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, have been very, very concerned about all of these issues, and many of us have written letters, and I think jointly we've written letters. So thank you for putting attention to this issue, and to all our guests, thank you for appearing, and particularly those of you who have the courage and the will to come and share your stories. I do have my two questions, and the first one will be for Ms. Robles. Ms. Robles, thank you again, first of all, for being a healthcare worker out there on the front lines during this pandemic. I can only imagine the additional stress that the situation with your husband has added to an already very stressful situation at work. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you're really dealing with this? I mean, do you have any comfort that your husband is getting a mask, is getting gloves, is doing the social distancing, and what transmission he may be creating among your own community? Tell us a little bit about what you're going through during this outbreak.
Yes. Just fearful for him. He does not have the tools in detention to social distance. Like I said before, they do get a mask, but they get it changed out maybe weekly. He is high risk. He has asthma, and which is hard with 5 other detainees for him to be safe. I worry about him every day, every second, every time I take care of a COVID patient, every time I get a call, he's on my mind of, I'm here protecting my community as much as I can, but yet my husband's in detention and his life is at risk.
Have you been able to speak with him at all?
Not as much as before. I do at least get to speak to him once a day, maybe for 10 minutes. Um, yeah, he's pretty fearful, and he's wanting to come home and to be safe in our home.
Right. Are you able to bring him additional masks or sanitizer or anything that you might be able to have available?
No, they do not let us enter the facility. We're not allowed to bring anything in from the outside.
Right. Well, my second question then, thank you so much, Ms. Robles, is for Ms. Altman. And I too have seen a lot of the news reports about the impact of ICE detainees and the lack of care and the potential risk to the surrounding communities. And I don't know if you saw in the Texas Tribune a recent article on Friday, and I'll submit it for later for viewing for all the audience. And it's about the number of COVID cases and the dealings of GO at the Pearsall, South Texas processing facility. And it pretty much is illustrative of some of the things you talked about the risk to the community, the people that are handling the detainees, the lack of hospital around there. I think there's one hospital with only like less than 50 beds. I mean, you said the study said that there would be probably 70-some% of the detainees maybe across America may be infected. I believe that's the number you said. Did that same study look at the the sort of the domino effect? If that's the detainees, how many would be the staff of the detention center? How would it spread to the rest of the community, and what potential numbers that may look like?
Thank you, Congresswoman. One of the things that the study did, they did not project, as far as I'm aware, the number of cases that you would see in staff, but they did look at the impact that the rapid spread would have on local hospitals and ICU beds, therefore rendering those beds unavailable to people in the community. And so I can read you just the highlight from those statistics. This is, again, they looked at, like all these projections do, they looked at the most optimistic scenario and the most pessimistic. So this is looking at the most optimistic scenario. They found that outbreaks among just a minimum of 58 facilities, and remember, we almost have that much already, that would overwhelm all ICU beds within a 10-mile radius of any of those facilities. And outbreaks among a minimum of just 3 facilities would overwhelm local ICU beds within a 50-mile radius. Those are all within 90-day periods. So that means that, absent dramatic change from ICE within a 90-day period, 3 months, we're looking at all hospitals within 10-mile radiuses of these facilities being overwhelmed and unable to care for people in need in those communities very quickly.
Well, very quickly, but my question is related to the contagion. If they're suggesting 72% of the detainees would be infected, what does that translate to with the population around them? I mean, we wouldn't say 72% of the population, but do they have a contagion factor in there?
Right. This study didn't take that next step to estimate, but I think we can look at other projection maps, right? I think we've all become kind of like layperson experts in these projection maps. And we can imagine that if you have 72% of the people in the jails, and then you have guards coming and going to their homes and their loved ones, the reason why the ICUs are overwhelmed is because the contagion is in the community as well.
Yeah, well, I'm also talking about like the people who deliver. I'm also talking about like the people who deliver their groceries, the people who deliver their it's more than just the people in the facility or even just their neighbors who work there. It's everybody. So, Chairwoman, I tend to send some follow-up questions on that because I'm concerned about the contagion factor and the rate to the communities around there, because obviously we have many of these in Texas, and I read somewhere that 1 out of 4 of the detainees that have tested positive are in Texas. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll give a chance for all the members to have additional questions after this meeting and roundtable, and we'll post the information that you referenced, Ms. Garcia. I'd like to invite our colleague, Mr. Neguse from Colorado, for any questions he might have. I understand also that this is your birthday, so happy birthday, Mr. Neguse, and welcome to speak now.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgren, for your leadership and for pulling together this roundtable. And thank you, of course, to our witnesses for participating, and to all of my colleagues. And I certainly could think of no better way to celebrate my birthday than to be here with you all doing this important work. And of course, this issue in particular, the need to continue to document the abuses that are happening at different facilities across the country is so critically important so that we can ultimately address these issues in future legislative packages. I also want to take a minute to say thank you to Claudia and to her husband. I appreciate so very much you all sharing your story. As my colleagues know, Claudia lives in Leadville, Colorado, which is here in my state, just outside of my congressional district. And our hearts and our prayers and our thoughts are certainly with you. And we appreciate everything you're doing on the front lines, caring for others as a healthcare worker during this pandemic. I want to ask my questions to Ms. Altman, to Director Altman. As you know, the GEO facility in particular that has been referenced is here in Colorado, is in Aurora. And we've had various interactions with that facility for quite some time. And I want to talk in particular about the immigration court that is housed in the Aurora facility, but also just more broadly speaking, immigration courts across the country. As you know, the Executive Office for Immigration Review has really taken a haphazard approach in its management of the immigration court system. And while they have postponed ultimately some, or rather I should say all, non-detained hearings, most immigration courts and detention centers remain open. One of those, as I mentioned, is in the Aurora Detention Center. Our office is hearing reports of a number of different issues that flow from the fact that that facility remains open, that court rather, including a lack of working telephones and a lack of confidential space to speak with attorneys. And so I'm wondering, Ms. Altman, if you can speak to those types of issues and what kind of ramifications that would have on a particular individual's case.
Thank you, Congressman Negusson, for all your advocacy around Aurora. We're so grateful. Right. So when people keep having their court hearings, that means that while they're inside detention in the middle of a global pandemic, they have to still figure out a way to prepare for their court hearings. Right. And there's no right to appointed counsel in immigration court hearings. So about 4 out of every 5 people in detention are trying to prepare their cases on their own. If they're being forced to continue their cases, we're hearing that immigration judges are in some cases not open to continuances, not open to allowing attorneys to appear telephonically. In many facilities, it is impossible to find a confidential space to have a phone conversation with your attorney, let alone access the phones if you don't have an attorney to call the people who you need to be in touch with to try to get evidence for your case. So right now, people are on their own trying to figure out how to defend themselves in their bond hearings, their only opportunity to get out of detention and be with their loved ones. And ICE, although it promised some congressional staffers, we understand that it would be making phone access free during the period of the pandemic, has failed to do so in many facilities. And so many people simply can't get the evidence they need for their hearings because they don't have the funds to make those calls. They may be able to reach their attorneys, but again, in many facilities, there's no way to do so confidentially. So people are really set up to fail, and that's more palpable than ever now when phones are the only lifeline to the outside world.
Well, thank you, Director Altman, and for your advocacy on these issues. You know, I've heard very similar complaints, and we have yet to receive any assurances from ICE in our inquiries that these issues have been resolved. Another example that we have heard that just is absurd in my view is the notion that litigants can't challenge the admissibility of a document that is being entered into evidence on the basis that they have not had the opportunity to examine it if they agree to appear telephonically, which again is just an absurd rule and an example of the I think the way in which due process is being infringed and impacted in a negative way for so many. So I thank you again for your activism, and knowing that we have any other members who wish to ask questions as well, I will follow up with written questions for you and for the other witnesses. And thank you again, Chair Lofgren.
Thank you so much. We'd now like to invite the gentlelady from Florida to ask any questions that she may have. You have to unmute your microphone. There you go.
Am I unmuted now?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chairwoman. Thank you, Heidi, and to the witnesses for sharing your stories today. You know, in the committee and the Democratic Caucus has been working day and night, really trying to ensure that Americans in our district have the resources that they need during this pandemic, from ensuring that we have the PPE equipment to making sure that they can navigate and get their unemployment benefits. But I think that this hearing, or I apologize, it's not a hearing, it's a forum, it's a conversation, it's bringing light to an issue that really affects all of us. And I think it's important to note that, just like everyone has mentioned, when we see a violation of human rights, which is, I think, what is happening in many of these detention facilities, what's happening is it's really putting at risk the lives of many people in these surrounding communities. I want to just note that we have a detention facility here in my district. It's the Chrome Detention Facility, and at its peak, it detains over 700 immigrants in conditions that we've seen are overcrowded, dangerous, very difficult to have social distancing. I've even gotten reports that ICE doesn't provide soap, cleaning supplies, or any PPE for those in custody. And we have heard that right now 11 detainees at Chrome have tested positive. We don't have the exact number of positive employees and contractors. While it's clear that these detention centers are vulnerable to the spread of COVID, these appalling conditions place hundreds of lives at risk here in our communities. I've sent multiple letters and emails to ICE. I have heard absolutely nothing. I have gotten no responses. ICE has refused to be transparent about the safety of not only the detainees, but also their employees and their contractors. A federal court found that the conditions at Chrome demonstrate, quote, that ICE has failed in its duty to protect the safety and the well-being of detainees, and that, quote, such failures amount to cruel and unusual punishment. Basically, ICE is not taking responsibility for the human lives in its custody. And as I mentioned before, there is a violation of basic human rights. I mean, we've seen home confinement being given just today to Paul Manafort. And while I'm glad to see that there are measures to protect those in federal prisons, that's very important. We need to ask this administration and ICE to immediately do more to protect the lives of those that are in custody. And as Chairman Nadler has mentioned, these are civil cases, they're not criminal cases. So I would like Heidi for you to speak about that. But my question relates more than anything. If you have heard or if you know of how many contractors that have come in and out of these facilities have tested positive across the country, and are you aware of contractors testing positive at any other detention facility besides Chrome?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We don't know, right? We don't know these numbers because ICE is not releasing them. And I think that there's been some incredible reporting out of Miami on this issue. So we don't know the numbers. We do know, I mean, for example, I think it was shared earlier that 2 contracted guards who worked in the Richwood facility in Illinois tragically died of COVID-19. So we certainly know that there are more cases of contractors. I appreciate so much your point about the fact that these are systemic human rights abuses that we're talking about in custody. And it brings to mind for me a woman who actually, Congressman Neguse, who spoke before you, I believe, has met with, who's been held in immigration detention now since August 2017. This is a woman named Kelly Gonzalez. She's a client of ours at NIJC. And she is a transgender woman and has a very strong asylum claim on the basis of persecution she'll face because of her gender identity. She also has severe anxiety, depression. You can only imagine having been detained for almost 3 years. The way she describes is that it's left her weak, it's left her vulnerable. She says she's barely able to sleep. She has constant headaches. Despite the spread of COVID-19 throughout the facility where she is, she has been denied parole applications repeatedly. Our brave advocates at NIJC are filing a second habeas petition for her. So this continued and prolonged detention in conditions this wretched can only be described, as you said, as truly systemic violations of the most basic and foundational human rights.
Heidi, I have so many questions for you. I know that other members want to ask, but we have a motto in our community in Key West. It's one human family. And especially during this pandemic, we need to remember we're all one human family and we need to take care of each other. And that includes hundreds in my district of immigrants that have been detained without really committing any violent crimes. And we cannot forget about them either. But just one last question. I know that the federal judge asked for these detainees in Chrome to be transferred. And so I want you to speak on those transfers. Do you think it's problematic? Do you think it poses dangers in other facilities?
Well, we know that it does. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question. And, we're hoping that more of these orders will be calling for release rather than transfers. So there's been enough transfers and enough spread of the cases now that there has been actual tracing done that shows that the transfers of folks within the ICE system is contributing greatly to the spread of the virus and to many deaths. BuzzFeed News just did a really upsetting expose showing one transfer of more than 70 people in detention from New York and Pennsylvania to a detention center in Texas that directly led to a new outbreak in that detention center in Texas. This is now happening across the country. Transfers are really a hallmark of ICE's detention system, and they always have been. And in this case, they are deadly.
Thank you so much, Heidi.
Thanks so much. Thank you. We're going to turn now to Veronica Escobar. Unmute your mic. Very
Thank
good.
you so much, Chairwoman Lofgren. Very grateful for this roundtable so that we can talk about ICE's handling of its response to COVID-19. I also want to thank Chairman Nadler, who was very responsive when I raised these issues at the during this terrible pandemic. And I also want to thank our guests and their incredibly powerful statements on what is actually happening inside these federal facilities across the country. This transparency is so important now more than ever. The Department of Homeland Security, so DHS and ICE's practices and policies, in my view, have essentially fueled the spread of the coronavirus, not just among the vulnerable population that's in their custody, but as my colleague Debbie Mukersel-Powell just said, basically among the community. Because by not protecting the vulnerable population, the migrants in their custody, what ICE has essentially done is put their agents, their staff, the lawyers who come in and out of the facility, the advocates who come in and out of the facility, put all of them at risk. And all of those folks who then have come into the ICE facilities, these federal facilities, they then go home to their families. They then go out into their community and put others at risk. And so really the federal government, specifically the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, I believe, have fueled the spread of the virus. And their policies like MPP, which sends DHS's policy that sends vulnerable asylum seekers to await their US hearings in Mexico, the flights to Central America, where we are essentially exporting the virus, Title 42 expulsions, where migrants are removed usually within an hour and a half. That's created a revolving door where more and more people are coming into contact with one another because they keep coming back to try to re-enter somewhere else. The transfers that have been mentioned here, in fact, the transfers were the cause of an outbreak here in El Paso at our ICE facility. And then all of this, of course, is the underlying problem is the lack of a national testing strategy, especially for vulnerable populations like those in detention. They've created a risk that has been so unnecessary. What ICE should be doing is halting the transfer and deportation of detainees during this pandemic, releasing all nonviolent detainees, and following its own federal government's guidelines, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I led a letter to ICE Director Albans outlining this. Still have not received a response. We have also alerted the Inspector General, IG Kufari. I feel like the Inspector General needs to be doing a lot more right now to protect detainees and employees. Mr. Favi, I have a question for you. And again, thank you so much for sharing that powerful testimony or sharing your experience with us at this roundtable. How many times were you tested for COVID-19?
As for April 2nd, after my affidavit, the ICE medical facility start testing us around that day, 12:52, and they test us once a day. And I was released on April 10th, so I've been tested 8 times before I left that facility.
Were you tested right before you were released?
No, ma'am. The ICE medical staff is not all the time in the detention. We don't have access 24/7 to the medical staff, and the doctor we have is a part-time doctor, and the nurse staff is kind of they stay there from maybe 8 to 9 or a 12-hour shift, and then they're gone. So we only have limited access to them. And I was released around 10 p.m. So there was no medical staff there when I was released.
I'm sorry.
We have a goal of ending this roundtable in about 10 minutes. So, and we have 2 more members for questions. So I'm wondering if there are additional questions, Veronica, if we can get them as a follow-on so we can get to the other 2 members before our drop dead date.
I yield back.
Thank you so much. Ms. Jackson-Lee, you are now recognized.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And thank you so very much, Madam Chair, for this very important forum. The same thing with Chairman Nadler, and let us evidence to everyone that we are doing our work, and particularly in the Judiciary Committee. I want to quickly make note to have this in the record that the media has indicated that 1,300 detainees have been tested as of May 5th. So the point is only 1,300 detainees have been tested as of May 5th. Many of the ICE detainees have been deported who were infected. And a recent epidemiological study conducted by medical experts indicates that if we don't respond to the testing after 90 days, between 72 to 100% of individuals in ICE are going to be infected by COVID-19. These are by experts dealing with the science of testing. I want to take note of the fact that immigrant advocates tried to deliver masks at the Otay Mesa Detention Center in California and were turned away. Texas COVID-19 cases in immigrant detention quadrupled in 2 weeks. So I'm interested, Ms. Altman, and thank you so very much for your work in the pending crisis that we may have as it relates to COVID-19 in particular, and particularly in the overall uh, uh, conditions, poor health conditions that many of the detainees have to face because of uncleanliness and the impact of the administration's attitude on immigration. And then to Mr. Um, Favi, thank you so very much. I want to have you restate again very quickly just what you were living through. Might have had masks. Were you tested? Did you see other people tested? I've tried to push for testing in these detention centers along with the Bureau of Prisons, and the response has not been the way it should be. So, Ms. Altman, I'd appreciate pending crisis, like my colleague, why can't we do virtual hearings? And to Mr. Bobby, if we would talk about, again, whether you were tested and cleanliness. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'll be brief because I would love to hear more from Johannes. What ICE needs to be doing is suspending interior enforcement of the civil immigration laws. Public health is more important. And that would mean that people would not be transferred into these facilities and then transferred among the facilities. And they need to be releasing those who are already there. They also need to be releasing people safely. So we have clients who our attorneys describe as literally being released to the street, only to do their best to make their way to their home where they can be sheltering safely in place. This is happening every day. ICE has so many guidelines, so many resources available to tell them what they need to be doing to better protect the health of those who are still jailed and to protect the communities around the jails. And they're intentionally at this point ignoring those guidelines. And as we've heard today, facilitating the spread of the virus.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. As for as stated before, the detention center already started testing us after we put a draft in with my lawyer for the habeas petition that was describing our living condition during the pandemic. And they was testing us once a day after lunch. So we was not really tested before that time, and the pandemic really started around November, and then it was officially CDC start warning us about January, if I remember what was shown on the news, and we only had the opportunity to start being tested on April. This was terrific, and it was very stressful for us to see God going home, coming back in there, coughing, inmate coughing every single day, and we was only given cold tabs. And we was told if the cough persists 7 days, to reach out to the medical staff to have a stronger medication like an antibiotics. But this was worse than just a cough. It was a pandemic going on outside.
Thank you very much. That's a pending crisis or a crisis that we should address. And it's been very informative on those issues. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I'd like to turn now to the last member, Congresswoman Scanlon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, if this pandemic has shown us one thing, it's that the problems we already knew about have just gotten that much worse. I wanted to focus on the fact that we're seeing the same issues with respect to the detention centers that we are with respect to our nursing homes and our jails. I mean, it's the congregate living situation that creates a lot of these issues. And if we're not testing and we're not taking care of people in those settings, then it, as everybody's been saying, it puts at risk the vulnerable people who are in the nursing home, the jail, the detention center, and it also puts at risk our general population. Here in the county where I live, we had an outbreak in our local jail, and it was brought to the jail by the guards, by members of the community. A limited number of them became infected folks in the jail, and then in turn, the folks in the jail, the residents there, infected more members of the staff. But what happened here, and they just did a story yesterday, was they got on it. They were able to quarantine people who were infected. They did a lot of testing. They tested everybody. And in addition to testing for COVID, they also tested for antibodies. And when they did that, they found that the majority of the inmates in the jail and the staff had already been exposed. So this thing is everywhere. And it just, once again, brings to light the fact that, you can't deal with a public health crisis by assuming that a virus is going to recognize borders, that it's going to recognize immigration status, or that it's going to recognize political party. And that's just this complete fallacy that is putting us in this very, very bizarre situation. You mentioned the problem with ICE transferring folks who are in detention, and that's where there's a crossover here. So we have a couple detention centers in Pennsylvania where people are housed in our county jails. They rent out a portion of the jail, despite the fact, as we've noted, that these are people who have not been convicted of a crime. They are still housed with people who are in jail because of criminal justice issues. So what we saw, and this was at York, they transferred York, Pennsylvania. We've had two of our criminal justice system inmates die there already. So we outbreak in the York jail, but they transferred, I think, about 20 to 30, I'm sorry, they moved 40 people out of one of our jails and sent them to Prairie Land, Texas. And I think that's the BuzzFeed story you're talking about. They were not doing testing in the jail system. They took these detainees, sent them to Texas, where there immediately was an outbreak. So, I mean, it's just a criminal lack of common sense that we're seeing here. We're not, ICE is not employing common sense protocols to test, to isolate, to take care of people in its system, and not doing the things that it could do, like releasing folks. I wanted to turn back really quickly, Ms. Altman, because we've talked a couple times about transparency and being able to get notice of what's going on. And do people have counsel? Do they have access to phones? 15 years ago, I was involved with an ABA project where they recruited volunteer attorneys to go into detention centers and look and see if people had access to counsel, access to phone, access to translation, so that we could have a window into what was going on in detention centers. And things weren't great then, but at least then the government was letting us in and allowing the ABA to compile reports that were then used to try to get a better situation. So can you give us a sense of, if someone's in trouble right now in one of these detention centers, do they have access to a phone? We know the Bureau of Prisons is allowing people to contact people by phone. Is ICE allowing detainees to use the phone? And do they have adequate access?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And no, there are many, many situations in which you could have someone in trouble without any way to reach out to the outside world. And I mentioned this before, but I just want to be really clear about it. ICE assured staff members for this committee and other committees of jurisdiction last week that they would be providing more than 500 free minutes to every single person in ICE custody. I've been speaking regularly with our legal services team. They're talking to their clients in jails in the Chicago area of responsibility. None of their clients have heard anything about this. None of our clients. 3 jails in Illinois contracting with ICE, and at least as far as we're aware, there are 0 free minutes. So this is ICE not only making blatant misrepresentations to your staff, they're also playing games with people's lives because right now in the midst of a pandemic, when the only way you can reach your family members loved one who you may have found out or heard might be infected, is the phones, and you don't have the money to make that very, very expensive phone call. You can imagine why that is causing a massive deterioration of individuals' mental health. The nursing home point that you raised, Congresswoman, is so compelling because these situations are so challenging. But this is a situation, ICE detention, where the problem is solvable. Because in ICE detention, ICE has this detention to release everyone.
Okay.
I think our time is just about up, Ms. Altman.
Back. Thank you.
And Ms. Sandler, we are.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Breaking up, but I'm content for you to take back over. We're good.
We are going to, since it is
testimony.
2:00, and we had promised to conclude by 2 this roundtable, I'm going to thank everyone, our guests for participating, our members for participating. I would like to note that we invited the Republican members of the subcommittee to join us in this roundtable, and they declined. I think this has been an important effort to learn more about ICE's behavior, how they are endangering not only the detainees who committed no crime, but our civil detainees. Not only that, but how they for having this, putting up with technical glitches, which we will hope to do in the after action review. With that, this roundtable is concluded with thanks to all.